Okay, in part two, I just want to give a synopsis of the work of Borja. So, in a third year course, in second semester, I would expect that many students doing this would have already come across Borja's ideas before. So, if that's the case, you can use this as a refresher. I do like to try and explain Borja a little bit differently than the traditional way of thinking about Borja, which pretty much focuses on habitus field and the forms of capital. And as you can probably tell, Borja is my favourite theorist. I could talk about him all day, really. So, again, I'm just going to touch upon his key ideas here and then kind of relate them to how we can think about consumer culture. So, importantly, Borja wants us to think about society relationally. That the fabric of our lives is how we relate to other things and other people and institutions. And we go through life kind of struggling in our engagements with these things. Now, struggles there doesn't necessarily mean that things are a hassle or they're bad. Struggles can be like and you're trying to have a good time, or just trying to make yourself a better person and that kind of thing. So this is a kind of way that people, a particular way of thinking about the way that individuals engage with the world. That they're struggling to create a good life, an ethical life, to have value. And they accumulate experiences, they accumulate being throughout that experience that kind of shapes who they are. So we all struggle to accumulate our beings and to be the person that we want to be. And we try to do this, to try successful in some context, try to be tasteful in others, or dignified, or cool, and or moral, and all these kind of things, or good. For the most part, we're trying to pursue to be successful in these particular fields. So there's a kind of socially sanctioned way to participate in life, and for the most part we struggle to do that and to be that. Now, a concept to think about this is Borja's notion of illusio. Illusio is kind of the stakes and the rewards of participating in particular things successfully. And the reasons that people might want to. So the illusio of going to very simply illusio of pursuing higher education. The rewards are to get a good, better paying job. Hopefully have more status. Maybe make yourself more attractive to to partners or something. So illusio here is about the kind of rewards that we're kind of struggling over in particular fields. Another concept that interrelates to this is the idea of social gravity, and this along with illusio fundamentally kind of challenges the notion of free choice. The idea is that we're kind of born into the world in a particular time and place. We have parents that are maybe working class or middle class or something like that, that'll have their own interests and their own influence on us. And this sets up a kind of notion of social gravity where we're drawn to some things more than others, based on what we feel is normal, what we feel is achievable, and what we feel is worthwhile. So in this sense, individuals are affected by social gravity, and this means two things. Firstly, we invest ourselves in various activities, whether that's trying to be good at a sport, or trying to do well at school, or trying to get a particular job. And once you invest in that over a certain amount of time, it creates a kind of gravity, a kind of sense of momentum where it's difficult to get off that path because you've started a trajectory, right? And once you've invested a fair bit of time and a fair bit of effort and a fair bit of emotion into something, it's not that easy just to make a choice to completely do something different or completely change your life. So that's one aspect of social gravity. The other relates to the notion of gravity in terms of heaviness. We know that the kind of life is short, that we need to make the right decisions, and so there's a gravity there in the sense that we know that our lives are important. We need to both treat it seriously, know that our choices have significance, so those things have a gravity. But the other sense is we're kind of pushed and pulled by things beyond our immediate control. So social gravity there is a kind of combination of those things. Our sense of seriousness in investing ourselves in various practices, and the way that in kind of a more magnetic field kind of way, metaphor, we're pushed and pulled by things beyond our control. So this also relates to notions of doxa and misrecognition that I don't have a lot of time to go into here, but I'll set a reading for you to be able to kind of delve into that in some more depth. So the notion of illusio is kind of, it helps us to relate to the why we invest our into things, because they have particular rewards. And the notion of social gravity gets us to think how we're pushed and pulled, and how we treat things seriously. So then this kind of allows us to think a little bit more widely about Borgia's key concepts that are kind of the trilogy of things that are mostly taught about Borgia to get an idea of what he has to say. So firstly, there's the habitus. Habitus is this kind of a set of dispositions that we develop through the socialization process of being born into the world, being, pretty much socialized by your family earlier on, then you move out into school. School's, a key side of socialization as well. Once you get into your mid to late teens, you start developing this habitus, this sense of feeling, this sense of being, this way of feeling comfortable in some places and not in others. Habitus here is a set of dispositions that you draw upon to, make decisions and to practice in, different parts of social life. So to think about the different parts of social life, Borgia constructs this methodological notion of field. So field is this way of thinking about different sections of society, how they have their own rules and relative autonomy from each other, where, being successful in one field, and the things you have to do in that wouldn't lead necessarily to success in another, that they have their own doxic, common sense kind of things taken for granted. They have their own rules and structures. But there's also a kind of a struggle going within the fields for its stakes, for its illusio. So, I don't know, the struggle in sociology, being a sociologist, is to make your work legitimate, make it influential, give it some impact, to raise its status and to have some impact on the wider world. You want to think about the field of sport, it would be, playing for Australia as, or, if you're at a local level, winning a premiership become the illusio, the stakes of the field. But then fields here need to be thought of having relative autonomy from each other, but they do also relate to the field, what Borgia calls the field of power, which is, often related to economic laws in particular. So it's important to think of habitus and field as very interrelating. They're not necessarily meant to replace agency as habitus and field as structure. In fact, that we develop our habitus in that early socialization period by participating in various fields of the family and education and, consuming the media. To be successful in particular fields, you have to draw upon your capitals, and Borgia argues that capitals are very unevenly distributed throughout the class system in particular. So Borgia's work is particularly useful for thinking about how class plays a role in the mediation of success and life chances. There's the economic, which is essentially, the money you have and the property you own, very similar to Marx's notion of capital. There's social capital, basically the networks of who you know and how they can help you be successful in particular fields. And there's cultural capital, and these are things like having an affinity with legitimate knowledge, having an affinity, say, with kind of artworks or music and cultural tastes that are seen as more legitimate and more authentic. They can be embodied things like the way you use language, the way you have a particular body language, the way you wear clothes. They could be institutionalized. Cultural capital will be forms of, say, the qualifications you have. And you can see there will be hierarchies here between, say, a degree from Harvard or Oxford as opposed to the status of a degree from Newcastle. So these kind of ideas of cultural capital move away from harsh economic realities and start thinking about how there's a cultural economy that also plays a role in terms of possibilities of success. When these things become consecrated and made legitimized, Borgia calls this symbolic capital. And those with more symbolic capital tend to be able to traverse through and between fields much more easily than those without it. So we can think about how, there's a kind of mix between different forms of capitals, and we can think about maybe different occupations as being able to be mapped, determined by how much, economic or cultural capital that you have. So when it comes to consumption, what Borgia is particularly useful for thinking about is that how there's a hierarchy of taste and lifestyles involved in consumer cultures that often have a lot to do with kind of that kind of, I suppose, Frankfurt School-esque ideology. But Borgia is also particularly useful for thinking about how people resist that and set up their own status systems outside of those dominant forms as well. So Borgia's key text here, which is probably one of the key texts in the study of consumer culture, is the huge study called Distinction that Borja did in France in the late 60s, early 70s, where he did both a statistical and a qualitative analysis of French consumption practices. And he started to be able to show that you can map particular things with particular classes. So he showed, for instance, that people from particular backgrounds were more likely to go to the opera, and from people from other backgrounds were more likely to read, say, a particular form of literature. Now, this seems like common sense now, and it's kind of the basis of much sociology, this stuff. But before Borgia's book Distinction, these connections weren't really made. So it's a kind of fundamental text here. The kind of key quote aphorism that you would have heard a lot throughout any sociology you've looked at already, I would imagine, is this idea that taste classifies and it classifies the classifier. So again, the idea that the way that we think about ourselves and the things that we see as legitimate or cool or good or whatever, those judgments we make classify us. Or if we do that, to other people, if we see someone wearing particular, what we might think as daggy clothing or something, we'll be classifying them. But the classifications we make in that situation also classifies us. And this is the relational aspect that Borgia wants us to think about when we, make these classifications. And this is what he calls distinction. That much of the way that we create our self-identity is a way of kind of engaging with that social identity in terms of the way that we relate to others and the way we want people to relate to us. So here he wants us to think about how cultural consumption seems to set up this hierarchy of how things are meant to be good or bad, tasteful or disgusting, or beautiful or ugly, and these kind of dichotomies that for Borgia are a relation of power. What he means by that is that those with more cultural capital, those in the professional industries that are kind of tastemakers, that are journalists and media people and academics and maybe chefs or musicians or artists, they get to basically decide what's tasteful and legitimate. And it's not necessarily a real or truthful thing, it's more a reflection of their own cultural power. Borgia wants us to think about here that there's kind of really these things are arbitrary. There's no real actual objective difference between many of the things that we put in these hierarchies, but the hierarchies exist because of cultural power relations. So an example I like to use here is, we can think about this in even absurd things that you wouldn't consider too much, making the normal look strange here. The idea that, say, the filet mignon is meant to be a better, in inverted commas there, cut of meat than T-bone. The T-bone here is a big, kind of vulgar piece of meat with a bone in it. The filet mignon is a kind of smaller cut of meat that, that's meant to melt in your mouth. The idea that one's better than the other here, according to the Borgesian analysis, is based on a particular refined kind of taste associated with middle classes. And there's no real kind of actual hierarchy here. It's a reflection of one group of people's taste over the other. It's not necessarily more legitimate, not necessarily better. It just reflects a particular power relation of who gets to make the world in their own image more than others. And so you can look through the list I've got there just to kind of think through some of those things. The wine between, cask wine and grain hermitage, or, literature with 50 Shades of Grey versus Shakespeare, pop music versus classical music, this kind of stuff. Now, what's interesting about all these things is, say, for wine, for instance, people's tastes can be fundamentally tricked by the different effects in a room, like by the lighting and the colouring or what music you play. And there's been some really interesting psychological experiments done with, so-called wine experts that the situation can actually be manipulated so they will actually mistake cask wine for grain hermitage or a similar relationship. So again, these are examples of the arbitrary nature of these hierarchies that we set up. So what Borgia wants us to think about here, and what the Borgesian perspective does, is it wants us not to think of taste as natural. It's fundamentally challenging the hierarchies that we set up in consumer culture and in broader culture in general. In this sense, taste is not natural, and having good taste isn't a natural, innate thing. It basically comes through the differences of socialization, and that those in the upper levels and the middle classes in particular, with more cultural capital and symbolic power, are the ones that get to create what's tasteful, what's cool, what's legitimate, what's moral, and all these kind of things. So taste here isn't natural. It's the culture of the highest classes become the most distinguished culture, apparently because it's innately superior, but really it's just because of the culture with those with more power, with more ability to shape the world. So cultural influence here leads to cultural power, and this lubricates social reproductions of inequality, because those are already in fairly, high cultural capital and economic capital positions get to be the ones that kind of define the rules and the doxic norms of particular fields, and this leads to those, in the lower rungs with less cultural capital having to kind of learn that new culture to become successful within those fields. So taste, again, is not natural here. It's produced, constructed, and maintained through unequal social relations. This is particularly important in education studies. You will have come across that before, but what we're kind of focusing upon here is the way that this stuff affects consumer culture, and particularly notions of cultural taste. And as people have pointed out, insults about your taken for granted preferences, what you like and don't like, can be really hurtful and humiliating. And what Borja's work wants us to point out here is that those in the lower rungs of the kind of social space with less cultural capital in particular experience that as on a day-to-day basis. And it means they will often then avoid experiencing that form of symbolic violence. And therefore there's a kind of almost self-fulfilling prophecy here where the disadvantaged and the marginalised exclude themselves what they're already excluded from. And this, again, reinforces social inequalities. So in the reading this week, there's, I think, a good example about this, in this section about olive oil. It's a little bit dated, as olive oil, I would say, over the past 10 years has become a bit more of a normal everyday item. But I think it's a nice little kind of everyday example that shows how distinctions are made. And you'll note here that it's not just distinctions made with the product itself. It's not just between, say, those who use olive oil and those who use vegetable fat. It becomes reflected in the language around those things that create these kind of cultural economies of taste, which are actually then reflected in cultural economies of values and morals and worth. So here, you saute your potatoes in olive oil, but, those people fry their chips in vegetable fat. You can see here how there's distinctions are made between, us and them through the way that not only the products themselves are consumed, but also the way that they're spoken about, and then the kind of, the values and morals that are set up around those practices. So you can see this particularly in the way that food develops over time. And it's important to note here that the kind of separations of classes that consume different things change over time. I think, say, sushi is a good example of that. 15 years ago, it was kind of seen as a high culture restaurant only thing, and these days it's much more common, and you see working class blokes, in their lunch break having it. But on the broader economy here, it's thinking about how the very things that we consume are modes of distinction. And that's kind of sets up a relation to how we think about ourselves and others, how we judge ourselves and others, how we talk about ourselves and others, and also then reflects in the kind of value systems that societies use to, I suppose, say that some people are more legitimate beings than others. So Borja's work here wants us to fundamentally engage with the very notion of culture, about how the hierarchies in it are socially produced, and that these things reinforce the dominant class structures.